For more on the president's attacks against the attorney general, I'm joined by Congresswoman Maxine Waters, Democrat from California. First, I'd like to get your response to a New York Times story that was just published, and it's about Rod Rosenstein, and check in on where you think your level of confidence in him is. In a meeting of the Justice Department, Rosenstein said the president had originally asked him to reference Russia in his memo. That's the memo he prepared, laying the sort of groundwork for Comey's firing. Rosenstein did not elaborate on what Trump wanted him to say. One person who is briefed on Rosenstein's conversation with the president said Mr. Trump had simply wanted Mr. Rosenstein to mention he was not personally under investigation in the Russia inquiry. So this is new information about a memo written by Andy McCabe saying that Rosenstein had been explicitly asked by the president to mention Russia in the Comey firing memo. What do you think of that?
Well, what I think is we have enough information about this president and his attempts to control Rosenstein and Jeff Sessions and to literally have them protect him from this investigation. I think it is clear that he's obstructed justice. I think that the more we delve into it, the more we see not only signs of it, but actually efforts by this president to get them to basically protect him from the fact that he has colluded with Russia. And that's it. I mean, you can call it any way that you would like to call it. But the fact of the matter is that we see the evidence of it. We see what he said, to Jeff Sessions and the way that he's treating Jeff Sessions, because Jeff Sessions said, listen, I'm recusing myself. I'm not lying for you. I'm scared of this stuff, and I'm not about to get myself into a position where I can be indicted. And he is really upset with him. He would love to get rid of him, but for the fact that he's got friends over the Senate side, these Republicans are saying, you'd better not do it, Mr. President.
You were one of the most outspoken critics of Jeff Sessions, very critical of his nomination to be Attorney General and his performance in that role. So I'm very curious. In the past, you've said even on this show, you think Sessions should be fired or he should quit. He should not have the job. What you make of the president's sort of continued public humiliation of his Attorney General?
Well, here's what I think. I think that the president does not care who you are. If, in fact, he needs you and you do not respond to him, if you do not protect him, if you do not lie for him, he will throw you under the bus. He will attack you. He has humiliated Jeff Sessions. I don't know why Jeff Sessions would even want to stay in the job, but he has shown that he does not care about Jeff Sessions or anybody else. He cares about saving himself. You know, as it's been said, Jeff Sessions was, the first senator, I believe, to support and endorse him in his campaign, to stand by him, to clearly indicate that he wanted him to be elected. But he's thrown all of that aside. He doesn't care about that. He is saying to Jeff Sessions, you're supposed to be here to protect me. You belong to me. And Jeff Sessions is saying, I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to endanger myself. Not at this point. I'm not doing that. And the president does not like that. He wants him out. He just does not know how to get him out without incurring the wrath of the senators, Republican senators who support Jeff Sessions.
Does that change your mind, though, I'm just curious if it changes the way you think of Sessions and his character?
No, I know who he is. I mean, I know how he's defined himself. He's a racist, and he has demonstrated that in more ways than one. I understand that. This is a different situation. Now this is about him and whether or not he is going to end up doing something that may cause him to be indicted. It's two different things. He's still the racist, but on this question of whether or not he's going to go down for the president, I think it's a different question, and he's not prepared to do that.
To the point that Lawrence Tribe was just making about impeachment and the question of it, which Rudy Giuliani seems eager to litigate, which supporters of the president seem eager to litigate, and Democrats seem reticent to. Where is your thinking on that question and the Democratic Party's approach to it as a whole?
Well, I'm with the 70%. 70% of Democrats who have been polled say that they think that he should be impeached. I'm with the 70%. I understand the reticence of my colleagues and the Democratic leadership who's saying, don't feed the notion that is being presented by the Republicans that say that all they want to do is impeach the president because they're mad about the fact they lost the election. I get that, and I understand why that would cause them to not want to talk about it. But I just don't have those fears. At some point in time, we have to deal with reality. We have to deal with some truths, and we have to deal with some facts. I know that people are saying we've got to wait and we've got to see what our special counsel will come up with. I get that, and I believe that we need facts in order to move forward, but the discussion must take place. We must not allow the President of the United States of America, who has this relationship with a country who hates us and who's undermined us and who has undermined our democracy, to not be talked about, to not be discussed, to not be talked about the reticence of our members to deal with it. I just will continue to talk about it. I think it is dangerous. I think that we should stand up for our country. This president has no respect for the Constitution. He's in bed with Putin and the oligarchs of Russia and the Kremlin, and it's come out already. So let the special counsel keep doing what he's doing in order to connect the dots for those people who say we need the positive proof. And I think we're going to get to the point where people are either going to have to stand up and resist this president and talk about he's dangerous for our democracy, or they're going to go down with him.
Congresswoman Maxine Waters, always a pleasure.